Well, happy, beautiful, amazing day. Dr. Bob Rakowski here out of Houston, Texas with the nitric oxide guru, the nitric oxide whisperer, Dr. Nathan Bryan. A little background. The first nitric oxide lecture I heard was from Farad Murad, and my head spun around more than I could imagine. I consider myself technically versed, but he was speaking Greek to me. And then a few conferences later, I saw you and it all made great sense. And I've been promoting it with every patient since then. I'm honored to share you with the wonderful world. Welcome.
Thanks, Dr. Bob. Good to see you. Yeah, it's been a long time, too long.
It's been a bit, but I want to share. I want you to share the backstory.
Yeah.
People don't care how much you know because you know as much as anybody in the world, maybe more than everybody in the world or anybody in the world regarding nitric oxide. How did you get so passionate about this topic?
I was introduced to the science of nitric oxide in the late 90s, right after the Nobel Prize was awarded for the discovery of nitric oxide to, as you mentioned, Fred Murad, Lou Ignaro, and Bob Furchgott. So I was a student at LSU School of Medicine. I was working on a PhD in molecular and cellular physiology, and there was this new science, this gas that's produced naturally in the lining of the blood vessels. It's gone in less than a second, but it seemed to regulate many important biological functions. And it was recognized even 25 years ago that the functional loss of nitric oxide is the earliest event in the onset and progression of all age-related chronic disease.
We've got to get that one again. Say it again.
Yeah, the functional loss of nitric oxide is the earliest event in the onset and progression of all age-related chronic disease. And it leads to decreased blood flow, it leads to inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune dysfunction. And that's the hallmark of every chronic disease.
All right. So now let's go with what is the very first thing that people would know? What's the first thing they're going to notice it typically with this functional loss of nitric oxide?
Well, we know that there's a hierarchy of symptoms that manifest. And so the first sign and symptom, and we call this the canary in the coal mine, but it's loss of sexual function. Because when you think about when you lose the ability to dilate the blood vessels of the sex organs, men develop erectile dysfunction, women develop female sexual arousal disorder, loss of libido, they become anorgasmic, and we call that sexual dysfunction. And then number two, your blood pressure starts to go up. Because if you lose the production of nitric oxide, which is a vasodilator, your blood vessels become constricted. Now you've got the same volume of blood going through smaller pipes and pressure comes up. And then thirdly, you start to develop metabolic disease. Because nitric oxide is involved in insulin signaling and glucose uptake. And 9 out of 10 Americans are metabolically unfit. It's a huge problem.
I think that's a mild estimate, by the way. It might be 97 out of 100, but
No, that's right. And then fourthly, you start to develop exercise intolerance. If you can't dilate the blood vessels, the coronary arteries, you get short of breath, fatigue. And then eventually what we're finding is you develop brain fog, mild cognitive impairment, dementia, and Alzheimer's. Those are all symptoms of nitric oxide deficiency.
now I'm hearing crazy stats about teens using Viagra because they need to. Uh, Tell me about that for a moment.
Yeah, so we're finding that, teens, people in their young 20s are developing erectile dysfunction. And drugs like Viagra are what we call phosphodiesterase inhibitors. And so they potentiate the effects of nitric oxide. But here's what we know. Those drugs were approved in 1998, and only 50% of the people that are prescribed Viagra or Levitra Cialis respond with better erections. So why is it that only 50% of the people respond to this medication? And it's because the people who do not respond aren't making enough nitric oxide to activate that second messenger system that the PD5 inhibitors potentiate. So again, it corroborates the fact that erectile dysfunction is a symptom of nitric oxide deficiency. But here's what we're finding now with our clinical data. If we give nitric oxide through our nitric oxide releasing technology, we can literally and figuratively prime the pump, increase cyclic GMP. Now the phosphodiesterase inhibitors become active and functional. And more importantly, you get restoration of normal sexual activity. You can eliminate the need for drug therapy or lower the dose of the PD5 inhibition therapy and make them much safer. But that's the mechanism. It's clearly elucidated. But again, erectile dysfunction is a symptom of nitric oxide deficiency.
Okay, so you said in the intro very, very nicely, it's a gas we make, right? So we're not gonna breathe it in from the atmosphere, but we should have some oxygen, we should have some nitrogen, How do we get them together?
Well, there's an enzyme in the lining of the blood vessels called nitric oxide synthase. And this enzyme, it evolved throughout eons and eons, like when and so it was originally thought to be an oxygen detoxification cycle. But this enzyme takes L-arginine, the guanidinonitrate of L-arginine, and converts that into nitric oxide gas. And it requires glutathione, oxygen, flavin-dependent cofactors, NADPH, heme iron, and calcium. But that's a very complex reaction. And then, interestingly, we have bacteria that live on the crypts of our tongue in the oral cavity that are constantly producing nitric oxide gas or inorganic nitrite. And when we swallow our own saliva, we get nitric oxide gas.
Let me put a qualifier on there, assuming we have those good bacteria in our mouth, but how many people do?
Now, what we're finding is that majority of people don't have the right oral bacterium. And the reason for that is, 73% of the municipalities in the US have fluoride in the drinking water. They put it in the drinking water because it's antibacterial, antiseptic. So it kills the bacteria in the water pipes, but it kills the bacteria in our pipes, which is a good thing. And then 2 out of 3 Americans use mouthwash every single day, an antiseptic mouthwash. There's fluoride in most toothpaste. So when people are brushing their teeth with a fluoride toothpaste, they're making their mouth aseptic and destroying the microbiome. And it's causing an increase in blood pressure. You lose the protective benefits of exercise, and it's making people sick.
So let's go to this fluoride for just a moment. I was actually listening to a podcast with Dr. Perlmutter, one of our favorite mentors, a brilliant neurologist who saw the value of functional medicine. So he says, wait a minute, everybody I talk to says, get the fluoride out of the water. So what's our option? What else could we do besides that?
Well, look, we have to pay attention to the data. Just last year, the National Toxicology Program published a multi-year dose escalation study on fluoride and looking at the toxicity. And the previous administration delayed or denied the publication of that report for 5 years. They've been sitting on this data for 5 years, and the government wouldn't allow them to publish because the data were pretty damning. It revealed that fluoride in the drinking water and fluoride rinses in dental offices can reduce the IQ in kids by 7 points. And it's shutting down your thyroid function. And fluoride is a neurotoxin, and it's an antiseptic. And we know, anything that destroys the microbiome, whether it's the gut microbiome or the oral microbiome, causes systemic disease. So then what's the benefit? There is no benefit to fluoride anymore. It's not important in remineralization of teeth, and it's all risk. So when you look at the quotient of risk benefit and there's no benefit and it's all risk, you eliminate the exposure of the American public from this toxin. That's the purpose of the National Toxicology Program, to highlight the toxicity, make policy recommendations, and then people look at the data and we get rid of it.
So let's be clear, it was the last administration that suppressed that. I don't want to get too political here, but you and I were communicating during COVID, and you had something that was epic for COVID. It was indisputably epic for COVID. Somehow I couldn't see the light of day in those hours. So share, what did you find that was so valuable for COVID? And when did you find it?
Well, we had this epiphany back in early 2020, right when COVID hit the global scale. And what we realized was the people that were getting sick and dying from COVID were the people who couldn't make nitric oxide. The elderly, people with previous heart attacks, kidney disease, on dialysis, diabetics, obese, the elderly. And so we developed a drug therapy, went a phase 3 clinical trial for an early therapy for COVID. And the idea was because, as you remember early on, the ERs and the hospitals were being overrun with illness. They didn't have the manpower, the beds to treat these people. So we were tasked with developing an early therapy. So let's catch patients within 72 hours of diagnosis or onset of symptoms. It was a randomized placebo-controlled controlled clinical trial. And then we would dose them and see if we could improve blood oxygen saturation, keep them out of the hospital, keep them off mechanical vent, and keep them from dying. And early on, we found enormous benefit from it. I mean, we were seeing in some patients get their blood oxygen saturation going from high 70s to high 90s within 8 minutes of taking our nitric oxide drug.
Wait. From 70s, which won't support life, to 90s, which is optimal in what period of time?
8 minutes.
In the sickest patients in the population.
That's right.
Think about that for a moment. If the worst of the worst can get that much better that fast, what about the best of the best?
Now that's right, and we treated over 600 really sick patients. Many of these patients were on over 20 different medications. There was no safety signal, and we seemed to get patients better. But
Okay,
as you
back
recall,
on you up for a second. People need to understand, what does it mean, no safety signal? It harmed nobody in any way. It's
it harmed
oh,
no one. I mean, the only thing we worry about is an unsafe drop in blood pressure in a condition called methemoglobinemia. And there were no signs and symptoms. There was no unsafe drop in blood pressure, no first dose effect, no increase in methemoglobin formation. So that revealed, even in the sickest patients on 24 different prescription medications, there was no contraindications, there was no interactions with current drug therapy. So what we were doing was extremely safe. But the challenge we ran into was the new administration at the time was not interested in early therapies.
the 2020 administration. That
They were only
you put in that again.
Yeah,
Yeah.
putting the shot in every arm around the globe, and unfortunately, that's what happened. And our drug study wasn't successful um, because COVID changed. There was new variants, and people weren't getting sick, going to the hospital, so it was costing too much money to keep our drug trial open. And it was a moving target. Then they kept moving the goalposts. So, we know the technology we've developed as a drug therapy. We're moving it forward now for Alzheimer's and heart disease. But when the next respiratory virus comes out, we've got a very safe and effective drug therapy for it that we'll redeploy.
So let's just talk about, as I heard, the original drug development for nitric oxide. They thought they were creating a blood pressure drug, but what happened? You know that story?
Well, that was the birth of Viagra, because they were developing the PD-5 inhibitors as a way to potentiate vasodilation, to lower pulmonary pressures, to dilate the coronary arteries, to overcome obstructive coronary heart disease. What they found was, yeah, it was very effective at dilating the blood vessels, but it was predominantly very effective at dilating the blood vessels of the sex organs. That's how this discovery was made. The men didn't want to give them back the study medication because they were having such powerful erections and improvement in erectile function. So that was the birth of the PD-5 inhibitors.
And then the smart people in pharma said, "Wait a minute, we've got, God knows how many blood pressure drugs. This is the first sex drug." And just like that, right? Uh,
That's right.
and by the way, let's just use that as a good indicator. We already talked about that being maybe the first thing that people see. Hopefully you're moving your body. You'd be aware if you had some level of exercise intolerance. But now, what's the best way for the average person to boost their nitric oxide production? And I will go back to this production because we have to make it, or
Yep.
maybe we can take the path of nitric oxide destruction, although I'd rather go from nitrated. Let's go nitrate destruction. So let's go both of those pathways. You kind of went into nitric oxide synthase. Uh, how long should we keep that viable? What are the best strategies? And let's go the other pathway.
Well, to answer that question, Bob, we have to go back 25 years because we had to first understand, how does the human body make nitric oxide? And then once we understood that, then we figured, okay, what's leading to the loss of the natural production? And then once we had a clear understanding of that, then and only then could we make recommendations. And so that's what I've done for the past 25 years, is understand those production pathways. So on average, if you just look at population-based studies, we lose about 10 to 12% of our endothelial function per decade. So that's about 10 to 12% of loss of nitric oxide starting in our late teens, early 20s. But now we know that we can maintain the function of that NOS enzyme, prevent its uncoupling, and maintain optimal nitric oxide throughout life. So just because there's an age-related decline in the general population doesn't necessarily mean there has to be. I'm 51, I'll be 52 in a couple of weeks, but I've got the vascular age of a 32-year-old. So I've regressed my vascular age by 20 years just by doing the things that I know affect the enzymology and the biochemistry of nitric oxide production. So what I tell people is, to answer your question, stop doing the things that disrupt it. So stop eating a high sugar, simple carbohydrate diet. Anything that leads to an increase in blood sugar completely shuts down nitric oxide production. Anything that you chew that has sugar, seed oils in terms of supplements, anything that causes an increase in blood sugar should be avoided. Number two, if you're using mouthwash, you must stop. Number three, if you're using fluoride in your toothpaste, you must stop. And then number four, you must stop using antacids, specifically the proton pump inhibitors, because those drugs are completely inhibiting nitric oxide production. And data now show that they're causing about a 40% increase in heart attack, stroke, and Alzheimer's. So once you stop that, stop eating anything that causes an increase in blood sugar, get rid of fluoride, mouthwash, and antacids. Now you've released the brakes on the body's ability to make nitric oxide naturally. Now, but we can activate it and stimulate it. Moderate physical exercise, 6 to 8 minutes of high intensity interval training, 20 to 30 minutes of moderate physical exercise. Throw in some more green leafy vegetables to utilize the nitrate in those vegetables. 20 to 30 minutes of sunlight every day. I like the first sunlight that comes up. Um, and then, intermittent fasting, 18-hour daily fast is remarkable in enhancing vascular function.
You know, I want to go quickly to the downside of organic farming for a moment because I've been promoting organic farming, organic food well over 30 years as soon as I knew the horrors of herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, but maybe fertilizer is essential. So you did a study on vegetables and I believe fruits all over. What did you find?
We did a survey across the US, and the question was how much broccoli, celery, spinach, cabbage would one need to eat to get enough nitrate to manage this blood pressure through this nitric oxide production pathway. And so this was in collaboration with Texas A&M Department of Food Science, where we went to Chicago, Los Angeles, Dallas, Raleigh, and New York. We went to the same retail grocer. We bought vegetables off the shelf. We brought them back to my lab at the Texas Medical Center in Houston, and we analyzed it. And we measured conventionally grown vegetables where you can add nitrogen-based fertilizers to the soil, and you can add herbicides or pesticides if they wish. And we compared it to organically grown, to which, again, to get an organic label, you can't add nitrogen-based fertilizers, no herbicides or pesticides. And what we found a lot of things to this. Number one, there's regional differences in agronomy and farming practices, and there's regional differences in the nitrate content and nutrient density of many vegetables. But the shocking thing was organically grown vegetables have on average about 5 to 10 times less inorganic nitrate than the conventionally grown. And then when you think about this, if you're not allowed to add nitrogen fertilizers to the soil, there's less nitrogen to assimilate in the plant in the form of nitrogen. So obviously they're less in nitrate.
I was thinking that in divine design, which my philosophy resonates with that completely. We've kept to deplete the soil. Maybe it was the mass farming that did it, but things like lightning strikes and even well, I guess the microbes, are the Earth's farmers. So have they looked at that connection? Lightning, bugs, all those things, are they making a difference in soil quality and nitrate level or nitrogen level?
Absolutely. The air we breathe in the atmosphere is 78% nitrogen. And this is it's a triple bond, that N2 molecule. So it's a very high energy bond, and it takes high energy systems to break that bond, and lightning does it. So in areas of the US where there's more lightning storms, the soil seems to be more enriched in nitrogen, usable forms of nitrogen, whether in ammonia or inorganic nitrate. And then also the bacteria, there's nitrifying bacteria in the soil that fix nitrogen so the plants can utilize it and assimilate it. But when we're spraying our crops and our lands with herbicides and pesticides or glyphosates that's killing all the soil bacteria, and then not rotationally grazing or rotational farming and putting the nutrients back, then the food that's grown in the soils aren't nutrient replete. In fact, there's a study that I saw several years ago. The same vegetables from the 1940s to the 2010s grown in the US, there's on average about 76% less just basic micronutrients in the soil. So we have to understand this, and we have to do better. We have to stop spraying herbicides, pesticides. We have to enrich the soil with nutrients, protect the microbiome in the soil, in our body, on our body, and we can't destroy it.
I think the simple bridge that I build for most of my patients is sick soil leads to sick plants lead to sick animals, sick plants and animals lead to sick humans. And everybody can build that bridge. I want to take a break for a sponsor, bettercoffeeshop.com, the world's cleanest organic coffee. No herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, molds, mycotoxins, or metals. Bettercoffeeshop.com. Take our one box challenge. Now, with that said, I also want to give a plug for your website, your toothpaste. Share that real quick and then tell us what are your top products that you have available to the consumer.
Well, I spent almost 30 years now in the nitric oxide field trying to understand, what leads to a loss of nitric oxide production, then how do we restore it? How do we fix these systems? And so that led me to a number of product developments, but we've been very innovative and before our time. But I make an orally disintegrating tablet. So if your body can't make nitric oxide, we do it for you. And remember, nitric oxide's a gas. It's
Let's
not a
premise is it's a lozenge. It's a nitric oxide lozenge, orally disintegrating tablet. I love you. You're speaking to the high level all the time.
That's right. So it's not a pill you can swallow. It's not something you can chew on and swallow. So it's a gas we have to provide for you. So the N1O1 nitric oxide lozenge produces nitric oxide. It takes 5 to 6 minutes for it to completely dissolve, but as it's dissolving, it's releasing nitric oxide. And it's restoring the oral microbiome, and it's recoupling the enzyme in the lining of the blood vessels. So we're improving the body's ability to naturally make it. That
I want to build a bridge real quick from this product. So have you studied it with Viagra type effect, and what's the window once they put it in? How long can the average person suffering, let's say, mild sexual dysfunction wait before they actually notice a difference in their sex organs?
Well, we have clinical data on that, and specifically in people with taking low dose 5 milligram tadalafil or Cialis. And what we find is if you're taking your once daily Cialis, you can take the lozenge, twice a day or maybe 5 minutes before intimacy, and we can improve erectile function. And then, we don't have any clinical data, but anecdotally, we say if people are taking Viagra, which is the more quick acting PD5 inhibitors, allow at least half an hour between dosing. But we can dilate the blood vessels, potentiate the effects of PD5 inhibition therapy. But the lozenge is really our hero product. It's your daily nitric oxide support, and then of course we make a fermented beet powder that we move the oxalates that we position as a pre workout or energy product. You mentioned our toothpaste. For 20 years we've known about the the dangers of fluoride, and so I've been using a non-fluorinated toothpaste for more than 20 years. But when I would go and look, there were still things in there that I didn't like. In our studies, it was disrupting the microbiome. So I was forced to develop my own nitric oxide friendly, microbiome friendly toothpaste. And so we call that Cardio Smile. But what we're finding is it selectively kills the pathogens. It remineralizes the tooth through an hydroxyapatite based uh, base. And then it's prebiotics that restore the normal flora. And what we're finding is it completely changes the oral flora, increases nitric oxide production, and we're finding people's blood pressure comes down. Okay, think about the global impact of that. High blood pressure is the number one driver for the number one killer of men and women worldwide. It's simply changing to a nitric oxide friendly toothpaste, blood pressure comes down. I mean, we've never seen that before. And then we make a topical nitric oxide for skincare and beauty.
Which, by the way, I had a friend, God bless him, paraplegic with, you know, serious bed sores, or pressure ulcers or whatever you wanna call it. I reached out to you. Thank you for taking that message, and we used the topical, and got complete resolution, which is, so epic, and I believe he said after checking in that didn't you have a family member that also led you to that development? Tell me about that.
That was the impetus for all of this was my dad. My dad had a car accident in 1984. So now for what, 42, 40, yeah, 40, 40 something years, he's been rolling around in a wheelchair, T11 compression injury. And so dad for, years dealt with decubitus ulcers, pressure ulcers. And in 2014, he had a stage 4 decubitus pressure ulcer over his right ischium under his right butt cheek. And he got septic, almost died, took him to the hospital, had to take really IV antibiotics for about 10 days. And then once he recovered from that and, he was at a critical condition, I took him to all the wound care docs I knew, and everyone told me we would never heal this wound in a 60-something-year-old diabetic paraplegic, and I just refused to accept that. So I started him on our lozenge, and then I started developing a topical nitric oxide that I would put inside the wound bed because non-healing wounds are typically there's no blood flow to the wound, and then they're typically chronically infected. So the nitric oxide that we were developing was antibacterial, was killing the infection in the wound, and it was recruiting capillaries and dilating blood vessels, and now getting blood flow to the wound, activating an immune response, mobilizing stem cells, and the wound healed itself. And all the wound care docs couldn't believe what they were seeing through this progression of a 4-year-old non-healing wound we healed in 8 months. So then they were like, "Well, how do we get our hands on this?" And so that's really was the impetus for bringing to market the aesthetic product, the beauty product. It's a dual chamber nitric oxide, but it's great for skincare. But we're taking that and we're working through the FDA now to get that drug approved for diabetic ulcers and non-healing wounds. But it's a game changer in wound care.
You mentioned a beetroot product, but let's just talk about beets across the board. Have you found that beets are epic for nitric oxide?
I think that beets are probably the poorest source of nitric oxide we could imagine. And the reason I say that is because all the products on the market, the beet powders, the beet juices, I've tested all of these, and there's no nitric oxide in any of these because these companies don't understand the science, right? So it's not the beets, it's what's in the beets. And that's what I've been able to harness in the way that we grow the beets, harvest the beets, ferment the beets to optimize the nitric oxide. So I tell people, save your money. Don't believe these commercials that you see on TV about, these beets providing nitric oxide because they don't. And not only do they don't, they can't because these companies don't understand the science and what it takes for the human body to make nitric oxide.
Couldn't we echo that really across nearly the board of what's out there in terms of nutrition? I mean, I'm almost overwhelmed at how bad the science is. When I was listening to you talk to Dr. Perlmutter, he was talking about that now MTHFR is getting a lot of press. Yeah, he said 20%, 30%. At one point, I heard 35% of the North American population, especially those that were in Europe. So Gary Brecka got some notoriety on MTHFR, but we've known about it for much longer than the rest of the world has. What's the deal with that, and how does it impact nitric oxide?
Well, it's first recognized as a methylation disorder, but what's happening when we understand biochemistry, there's metabolic shuttling through these pathways. So one of the biochemical steps in MTHFR is reduction of bioctrin to tetrahydrobiopterin, or BH2 to BH4. Then BH4 feeds through the nitric oxide synthase enzyme to make nitric oxide. But if you don't have BH4, reduced BH4, then the nitric oxide synthase enzyme becomes uncoupled and you can't make nitric oxide. So the MTHFR, these patients are unable to produce their own BH4, tetrahydrobiopterin, and as a consequence, they develop endothelial dysfunction and nitric oxide insufficiency.
And it goes a lot further than that too. It's a critical in brain chemistry and
Absolutely.
so many different pathways. So what's your favorite solution for that?
Well, I think number one, you have to realize if you have a genetic SNP in it, the single nucleotide polymorphism, a homozygous or heterozygous, so then you can support that pathway by taking methylated B vitamins, methylfolate, and just making sure it's not done clinically, but in the research lab, we can measure BH4 to BH2 ratios and make sure you have the optimal ratios. Or, with our technology, it's unique in the fact that we're not relying on those endogenous systems. So if you have an MTHFR SNP, the only source of nitric oxide you're probably getting is from our lozenge because it's an exogenous source that we're providing your body, even in the event your body's not able to manufacture it itself.
Now this comes in where a little knowledge is dangerous. Some people are saying, okay, beetroot's good. I'll put it in a supplement, make people think they're getting nitric oxide. But we might have done a disservice to the world by giving folic acid as opposed to methylfolate. Any comments or thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think a lot of times we overdo everything. We fortify everything. We, put folate and B vitamins and everything, and then dose dictates toxicity. And so if we're fortifying all this, and same thing with iron, we're over fortifying iron because iron's in most processed foods, and same thing. So we have to, get to optimal doses, and not there's really not a one size fits all. But yeah, I think what we try to do is recapitulate physiology, right, and mimic what the body would naturally do, and so we have to give compounds or supplements in the form that the body would naturally make because it recognizes the difference.
I want to go to arginine for just a moment. And, there's a lot of people that thought, okay, here's how we make nitric oxide. It's from arginine. Let me load up on that. So, how often would you guess that's a good idea versus a pretty bad idea? In what percentage of the population would be a good idea versus bad?
I never think it's a good idea because again, it's risk benefit. What's the benefit? There is no benefits because the human body is never deficient in arginine, right? We get it from the breakdown of proteins, whether it's plant or animal protein. And then every cell in the human body has the partial urea cycle. And that partial urea cycle is continuously manufacturing arginine. And then it goes through nitric oxide. We get citrulline, arginosuccinate synthase, arginosuccinate lyase, reform L-arginine. So if we're never deficient in an amino acid, there's never a need to supplement. And now, okay, so there's no benefit. What's the risk? There's two clinical studies showing that if you just had a heart attack and you take arginine, it leads to higher mortality and higher morbidity. And it was killing people more so than a placebo. And then in patients with peripheral artery disease, if you treat chronically with L-arginine, they get worse. Intermittent claudication gets worse. Quality of life gets worse. So in both of those studies, it said L-arginine should not be recommended, and in fact, should be contraindicated in post-infarct patients and patients with peripheral artery disease. But it's anybody with endothelial dysfunction. You cannot force arginine into the cell, because when you do, it produces superoxide instead of nitric oxide. So I tell people that's an easy litmus test. If you're buying a nitric oxide product that has arginine or citrulline in the ingredients, then that's an easy test that that company that's selling you that product doesn't understand the basic biochemistry and enzymology of how you produce nitric oxide. So save your money. They don't know what they're doing, and trust the science.
You know what? I might even go further to say you better be very diligent about everything because I'm literally finding the quality of the nutraceuticals companies. Here's a stat that a lot of people don't know. Big Pharma has spent something near $20 billion in the last 7 years buying up nutraceutical companies. And do we think that that's because they want to make them better? I'm not convinced that that's the case.
No, look, I mean, it happens all the time. Big companies buy up little companies and shelve their technology because it's impeding upon their market share. So it's obviously not, there's no money in curing, right? As we know, there's money in treating for the life of that customer, that patient. So anything that's disruptive, that's why what we do is so disruptive, is because now when we focus on restorative physiology, adequately produce nitric oxide, you start to get people off prescription drugs, because when we dilate the blood vessels and normalize blood pressure, there's no need for antihypertensives. We see a reduction in inflammation, so NSAIDs go down. We see, mobilization of stem cells, so we're repairing and replacing dysfunctional cells. We're dilating blood vessels, perfusing neurons, so neuropathy goes away. I mean, we're making people better, but yet, it's disruptive, and that's why we have to be careful out there, because it's a dangerous world, and we've been a target of lawsuits and attacks, and personal, professional, and it's a tough world out there.
Now you've just opened a whole list of crazy questions on every different topic I could imagine. The last one I want to wrap up with, because we're at that magic time, mitochondria. The average person does not have very efficient mitochondria. Do you have hard data on how your nitric oxide support can enhance mitochondria, which in theory could make as much as 94.4% of human energy?
No, absolutely. I mean, there's a clear data on the role of nitric oxide, endogenous nitric oxide production, and not only mitochondrial production of ATP and the efficiency of oxygen utilization to make ATP, because it prevents electron leakage at complex 1 and prevents superoxide production. So it's recoupling the electron transport chain. It extends the oxygen gradient in the tissue. So now you're producing more ATP more efficiently, even with less oxygen. And then when we look at the adaptive effects, nitric oxide is what causes the cell to increase the mitochondrial biogenesis. So things like intermittent fasting, caloric restrictions, sirtuins that you can give or do, all of that is dependent upon the cell's ability to produce nitric oxide. So if the enzyme in the cell isn't functional, you can do intermittent fasting, caloric restriction, but if the cell can't make nitric oxide, you don't get mitochondrial biogenesis. If we fix the enzyme or we give nitric oxide, we induce that PGC1 alpha signaling, leads to mitochondrial biogenesis. So the net effect is now you have every cell has more mitochondria generating more energy more efficiently with less oxygen. And that's the goal. How you optimize the human.
That is the ultimate anti-aging strategy: energy efficiency, fat loss, better brain chemistry, better sexual function, better life across the board. Dr. Nathan Bryant, this has been absolutely amazing. I think we're going to need to have another conversation because, oh my gosh, the world needs to hear this again and again and again, but better than hear it, take action. We're going to put the link to your website in the bio, or whatever notes they're going to see, depending on what platform they see. I'd like everybody I believe you owe it to yourself to try the lozenges. You owe it to yourself to try the toothpaste. And then if you want beautiful skin, you might want to try some of those topicals as well. So as always, I'm Dr. Bob Rakowski, absolutely knowing that we can all be happy, healthy, and successful.